Volume 4 sees Cinder weakened and mute, unable to speak and missing an eye. Her hair is short now, much like in the flashback to her younger days, and she bears extensive facial scarring, to the point a mask made of obsidian glass covers her destroyed left eye. Oh, and she's alive. I always found it kind of weird that Cinder's left eye was the one destroyed. How is it that her fully exposed and unprotected right eye is just fine, but her left eye, which was at least covered by hair, as meager of protection as that was, is the one damaged? Was the light just so blinding and intense that it burned out her eye? If so, why would the eye that was covered be destroyed while the eye that was uncovered be fine? Does it have anything to do with the parallels of Amber's scarring via the Grim Glove Beetle and Cinder's? Evidently she's not dead, and Ruby's silver-eyed warrior powers have physically maimed her as well as rendered her mute, an experience she temporarily shares with Neo. She must now communicate in gasping whispers to Emerald, who serves as her mouthpiece to vocalize her thoughts. Watts and Tyrion, the new villains, mock her, and this is the first problem I have with Volume 4. Earlier, I mentioned how Cinder seemed to be on good terms with Watts, as evidenced by her comment earlier in Volume 3.
Besides, the last of the heavy lifting is being taken care of, thanks to our clever little friend.
Seeing Watts' emblematic insignia emblazoned upon the upper corner of her scroll, it's evident she's referring to Watts, who was introduced in the volume after that comment. But now, and henceforth, Watts has been rude and snide to Cinder, constantly berating and demeaning her, which is at odds with how Cinder perceived their relationship. I didn't expect them to be the best of friends, but Watts inexplicably hates her, while Cinder gave no indication that was the way they were. Why would she consider him a
clever little friend?
Why would she pay him a compliment in his absence if they had bad blood? The writers may try to wave this away by saying Watts isn't particularly fond of failure. But like, what's got his knickerbockers in a twist? Why does he care that Cinder allegedly failed? She literally succeeded in her objective, attaining the maiden powers and causing Beacon to fall, and the only way she can be considered a failure is that she didn't obtain the relic. But even then, that means literally nothing to him, as Watts is only in league with Salem's faction because he wants revenge on Ironwood, and by extension Atlas because Dom Daddy Ironwood didn't cater to his praise kink. Cinder's alleged failure means literally nothing in the grand scheme of things to him, so why was he so needlessly bitchy to her, when it's implied that they previously were on decent terms? Salem reveals that Cinder's maiden powers come with a crippling weakness, and it's never clarified if it's solely because she's a maiden or if it's because she acquired the maiden powers with the Grim Beetle thing, and thus that makes her vulnerable to the Silver-Eyed Warrior powers the same way that normal Grim are. Like, would Ruby Silver Eyes work on Raven or Penny or Winter now, given that Penny didn't react at all when Ruby blasted Cinder with her eyes? I guess it's only Cinder's maiden powers that are affected because of how she acquired them through grim means. Salem hands out assignments, including assigning Watts to meet with Leo instead of Cinder, who was originally slated to do so. Via Emerald, Cinder requests as to what will happen to Ruby, and Salem accommodates her, reassigning Tyrion to hunt her down and bring her back. What's curious here is for the first time, we see Cinder express something other than smug confidence. She's unsure, she's weakened, she's humiliated, she's angry, she isn't on top anymore. She is, allegedly, a failure. She needs to relearn to do basic things and is gifted with a grim arm instead of Salem having Watts create Cinder a robotic prosthetic arm, the way he created a robotic prosthetic tail for Tyrion. I can only assume it was Salem's desire to be petty and ensure she had a closer direction and more control over Cinder thanks to her control over Grim. Or perhaps there's the writer's ableist message and apparent disdain for prosthetics, and equating them to a loss of humanity, a la Ironwood and by the same principle Yang, except taken to the even more ableist extreme with the implication that having prosthetics don't make you not only not human, but something actively monstrous, as demonstrated by Cinder's grim arm. Cinder is being taught to control what would later be revealed in Volume 5 as her shadow hand, the grim arm grafted onto her body. I originally thought Salem was talking about the seer that comes in moments later, but no, it's the shadow hand hidden under Cinder's robe that must be domesticated. Salem also has Cinder confirm that Ozpin was killed, so good to know he didn't just disappear, even though it was off-screened and therefore not a graphic death, and indeed an implied one at best. A problem the show wouldn't seem to have when it comes to more queer-coded characters. Here's looking at you, kid. Clover deserves better. Cinder's next scene is when she's seen training against Grim and honing her maiden powers. Salem calls a stop to it and berates Cinder.
Enough. I thought you were the girl that wanted power. Did you lie to me? Then stop holding back. If you wish to master your new powers, you must...
Notice how Cinder flinches when Salem raises her voice. This is a woman who has clearly been abused before. She can't even look Salem in the eye and has to compose herself before she responds with a headshake. This is the first real inkling of Cinder's backstory since last volume, and it looked like they were going to finally explain more, except Tyrion came in and ruined everything. It should be noted that I hated Tyrion's character from the jump, since his very inception, because I cannot stand the kooky, crazy psycho archetype because it's so lazily used and often used as a kind of, look, he's crazy, anything goes, kind of thing in order to substitute having to write an actual personality beyond crazy. I also truly hated him in Volume 7 for what he did to Clover, but somehow warmed up to him in Volumes 7 and 8, so I don't know how the fuck that happened, but back here I hated his guts. Anyway, it's too little too late. If Cinder was to have a follow-up to or expounding upon of her backstory, it should have been Volume 4. Volume 5 at the latest. Hell, I would have even seen it as possible for Volume 6, given Cinder was all alone and on her own, and it would have been a great time to study her character and figure out who she was, and what makes her tick beneath the facade and veneer she puts up in Volumes 1 to 3. If ever there was an optimal time for Cinder's backstory, it was Volume 4. So of course, all we got was a mere hint of her backstory and her relation to Salem, and at the very end of the Volume 2. Only to have it interrupted by Tyrion, because he's clearly the writer's favorite of the villains, and we wouldn't hear a damn thing about Cinder's backstory again until the end of Volume 7, 3 years later. Even more so, we wouldn't get Cinder's backstory at all until Volume 8. And on top of that generic, uninspired backstory failed to even encapsulate the entirety of her past, or at the very least, the most important question. How did she come to be in the service of Salem? The 4th volume would have been the perfect time to get to know Cinder, when she was at her lowest and also her character was evolving and revealing more of who she was beyond her sexy, confident, manipulative, master planner demeanor. That was a massive missed opportunity. From their brief exchange, we're only left to wonder. What did Salem mean when she said she thought Cinder was a girl who wanted power? When did they have that conversation? Is it a callback to this line in Volume 3?
I want to be strong.
For a beautiful woman.
I'm sorry?
I want to be feared.
What? Impossible! What did it...
I want to be powerful.
I think so. It's very likely that's what Salem is referring to, but we still don't know why Cinder wants to be strong or feared or powerful. We don't know basic, fundamental aspects or history of our main villain. That is a failing on the part of the writers. To their credit, at this point, Cinder was still kind of interesting. She was vulnerable, weak, and forced to reassess who she was and start not quite from scratch, but close enough. Ruby basically hard reset, factory formatted Cinder like she was Penny, and we didn't get to see any of the work that went into Cinder's character developing or returning back to normal beyond her having a training session once. This is one of the rare times we see Cinder act horrified, and it's inexplicable. She witnesses Tyrion rip and tear the alpha Beowulf to shreds, and she is scared of his ferocity, of his animalistic rage, of the needless brutality he's displaying. But why? This is Cinder. This is the woman who delighted in watching Beacon fall and literally killing people. She's displayed no real empathy nor compassion. Every time she's been benevolent to her lackeys, it's read more like she's being falsely affable, like she is intentionally using compliments to appeal to them, to satisfy their egos and keep them in line. She has zero issues killing people or damning people to their deaths. She herself was straight up murdering Grimm with zero hesitation nor a care in the world. Moreover, these are Grimm. They're soulless, they're cannon fodder, and everyone in the series treats them that way. Why would Cinder care that Tyrion brutalizes the Grimm as though she hadn't been slaughtering them herself just minutes before? The narrative wants you to feel as though Cinder is surprised by Tyrion's brutality, and that it scares her, and it's nothing we haven't seen before from Cinder herself. This is just another scene to demonstrate how much they like Tyrion, and how that informs how they present information to the viewer, even if that information doesn't make sense. They just want a cool Tyrion scene, as though they're trying to apply rule of cool here to dismiss any lapses in logic or logistics. But it doesn't work, because Tyrion is literally just stabbing a Grimm over and over, and switching from sobbing hysterically to laughing hysterically. Literally nothing about that is cool. It's just a scene to cater to Tyrion and throws Cinder's previous characterization under the bus for no real tangible benefit nor sensible outcome. I mean, it would have been one thing if this had been the start of the arc that Cinder realizes she's gotten in too deep with this, a moment of realization that she's among people who are literally evil, and that she's gone too far and doesn't want this, that she realizes her previous actions have been wrong, and that the narrative would try to Zuko Cinder's way out of being a villain. in terms of beginning down the road to redemption, in as much as she can after everything she's done up to and including murdering Pyrenicos, arranging for the death of Penny Polendina, murdering Professor Ozpin, and ensuring the death of thousands during the fall of Beacon. That would have been an interesting direction to take Cinder's character, to see if the writers could get the audience to empathize with Cinder, our literal main antagonist, after everything she's done. Not forgive her, but help us understand why she did what she did, why she wants power and to be feared so badly, why we should invest in her character. But you should come to expect by now the answer to these questions would never be forthcoming. The finale of Volume 4 has Cinder commanding Emerald to summon an illusory image of Ruby Rose, inexplicably getting her outfit correct, despite having no way of knowing that information unless Tyrion is a really good describer, as Unicorn of War considered, and immolating the intangible Ruby with a torrential pillar of fire. But we're supposed to believe that Cinder is horrified that Tyrion would do something as mundane as repetitive stabbing to a Grimm, where she's cool with herself killing a human being. It's maddening levels of narrative cognitive dissonance that makes this show such a mental whiplash to watch. Or maybe Cinder's just that petty. I mean, her reasons for wanting Ruby dead after being defeated and maimed by her, literally mauled to the point she lost an eye and an arm, though we don't know the latter at this point, are 100% justifiable. You'd be mad as fuck too if someone partially blinded you and severed your limb. Also, why is the Ruby illusion fading in and out of existence? Didn't Emerald say,
headache. One mind I can handle, but two is a stretch.
She's literally only manipulating Cinder's mind right here. There's no reason it should pop in and out of view. I get it's kind of like for the audience's benefit and a visual thing, but it makes no sense still. Maybe I'm just being nitpicky. Oh well. I want to note that Volume 4 relegated Cinder to the status of Salem's subordinate. Sure, it was hinted at that Cinder served someone in Volume 3's flashback episode, but still, Cinder had agency and autonomy and was still the true big bad. But just like Roman was revealed to be Cinder's lackey, Cinder in turn was revealed to be Salem's lackey. As Reddit user Matt Obito pointed out, Cinder is just Salem's Torchwick. What was the point of radically altering Cinder's character with such a pivotal change at the end of Volume 3 in order to introduce the concept of silver-eyed warriors and their powers if Ruby never bothered to do anything with this series-shaking information and development and would continue to not do anything with it for the next 3 volumes, not even once asking about it or trying to figure it out until another character in the form of Maria Calavera prompted her in Volume 6. Why ruin Cinder's character for a concept that would go unmentioned and unexplored for years yet? Here's the takeaway from Volume 4. Cinder was at her lowest. She was open to the greatest change according to the philosophy of the Legend of Korra. We could have really gotten to know about Cinder, perhaps even some backstory. Her character's situation in the end of Volume 3 could have been very fertile ground for where her character could grow. At the very least, we see her struggle and have to come to terms with her newfound disabilities, come to a place of new beginnings and learn how to navigate her new life without her eye or arm, and at the weakest she's ever been. We should have seen Cinder fight to get back all she's lost, and also understand why she hates Ruby, the girl who forced her to feel so weak and powerless after having vowed to never be made to feel that way again, and having gone through all that trouble, that planning, that waiting, in order to acquire such power. Instead, the writers made the giga-tier dumb stupid choice to off-screen Cinder's recovery, and I want to be understanding and recognize they had to juggle so many characters in separate arcs in Volume 4, but also, no, I don't recognize that, because they wrote themselves into that position, and so that's their own fault. Aw, did someone realize they kind of suck at writing? Volume 5 sees Cinder recovered from her injuries dealt to her at the hands of Ruby Rose at the end of Volume 3 an entire volume ago. Salem tasks her to convince Raven Bronwyn and her tribe that their survival depends on their cooperating with Salem's forces. Salem gives Cinder leave to speak her mind, and here's where it's apparent Cinder's character is starting to regress.
I don't understand. Working with bandits? Keeping Ruby alive? What's the point? We're strong enough to take what we want by force.
Salem reminds her to
Never underestimate the usefulness of others.
Here's the problem with this scene. As Cinder is currently established by this point, the scene is wildly out of character for her. From volumes 1 to 3, Cinder has consistently relied on the usefulness of others. Her plans literally hinged on them. Every single thing she did with the help of her team and those she contracted or drafted to help her. Acquired the Fall Maiden's powers? She had Emerald and Mercury help her subdue Amber. Steal all the dust and veil? She had Roman Torchwick do that for her. Needed grunt work to be done for some reason? She had Torchwick cooperate with the White Fang at her insistence. Infiltrate Beacon? She had Emerald and Mercury by her side. Plant the Black Queen virus? She had Emerald and Mercury on the lookout so she can do it without being disturbed. Discover what the abilities and semblances were of the students? She had Mercury instigate a fight and deduce information relevant to their plans. Ensure Yang dismembered Mercury? She had Emerald's semblance to thank. Needed a getaway driver to transport Mercury away from Amity Coliseum? She had Neo pilot the plane. Ensure Pyrrha killed Penny? She has Emerald semblance fuck with Pyrrha's mind too. Take down Beacon? She enlisted Torchwick and the White Fang to destroy Beacon Academy and ransack Vale. Literally everything she's done has been with the help of her team, or people she's got in her corner. If anyone knows the value of teamwork and to never underestimate others, it's Cinder fucking Fall. Here were some major red flags with respect to the writing team. Here is some major warning bells as to them demonstrating they don't even understand their own character that they created, that they write for. It's another case of the narrative telling us one thing, trying to get us to believe something, when that information is in direct contradiction with what we have already witnessed. They retcon Cinder's character for the worse, making her headstrong and hot-headed and unable to see the big picture, when for 3 fucking years, we've seen the writers characterize her as someone who's methodical and cool-headed and works from the shadows and clever and works smart, not hard. Even more damning is that this scene with Salem is literally just a rehash of a scene we've already had, with Cinder and Mercury and Emerald. Let me play this scene for you again.
I don't understand. Working with bandits? Keeping Ruby alive? What's the point? We're strong enough to take what we want by force.
Never underestimate the usefulness of others.
Now take a look at the scene from Volume 2.
You should be able to take her no problem.
It's not about overpowering the enemy. It's about taking away what power they have. And we will. In time.
You look at those two scenes and you tell me what's the fucking difference. I'll save you some time. There is none. They are the exact same scene. The only variation is who is speaking what lines. Cinder elucidates Mercury as to what their real goal is. Not using brute strength to get their way, but ensuring that the enemy has no way of getting their own. Cinder is being smart here. If she tries to overpower the enemy, they have a fighting chance of stopping and beating her. If she takes away what power they have, they cannot stop her. 3 volumes later, we have Salem speaking to Cinder the way Cinder spoke to Mercury. We have the writers writing a scene where Salem teaches Cinder something she already knows. We know she knows it because we fucking saw her teach the exact same thing to her own underlings. The writers literally expect you to forget the way Cinder was previously characterized in order to sell you this scene with Salem. If you had any recollection of how Cinder was portrayed in volumes 1 to 3, you are now expected to discard it and accept at face value that Cinder does not know how to understand the usefulness of others, despite literally 3 volumes demonstrating the exact opposite of what the narrative is trying to sell you now. We are expected to just take the writers at their word. Contradictions be damned. What's the takeaway here, Kruby? That Cinder is suddenly stupid and forgot how to do what she'd been doing for 3 volumes now? That once she got the maiden powers, she forgot the concept of teamwork or deception or even the very notion of subtlety? That the events of volumes 1 to 3 didn't really happen? That Cinder never really understood the usefulness of others, despite every single action she took being predicated on the help of her faction and their allies? My honest suspicion is that once Miles and Carrie introduced Salem as a true big bad, they demoted Cinder to lackey status, which isn't inherently a bad thing because Salem's existence was at least established since the very first episode. It didn't come out of nowhere. But in order to sell Salem as this wise, tactical, evil witch queen who knows how to play the game, Miles and Carrie had to literally reduce Cinder's intelligence and retcon literally 3 previous volumes in order to have Salem teach Cinder a lesson we, the audience, objectively knew she already intrinsically understood. Because we literally watched her do that exact thing for 3 years. Instead of establishing Salem as a villainous leader in her own right, the writers warped Cinder's character for the worse in order to sell Salem as better in that regard. Otherwise, why would they have Salem be the big bad if her underling was smarter and more competent than her? So Miles and Carrie took away from Cinder in order to give to Salem. She was made lesser so that Salem could be greater. That is an awful fucking way to establish your characters. Can you imagine taking an axe to an already established character, literally warping them without due cause solely to try and sell someone else as a bigger threat, especially when said threat literally just sits around and does nothing and is the least active antagonist in the entire series? In what way is it a good idea that you plant the seeds of ruination of an already excellently established character, someone who was a strong antagonist, in order to hype up her boss as better? Why are you treating character development like a zero-sum game? Why can Salem only be seen as smart if Cinder is seen as stupid, a direct contradiction of her earlier characterization? As you'll come to see with Ruby, when it comes to these writers, their priorities are flawed and their handling of their characters is, to say it bluntly, simply disrespectful on a level that is unprofessional and disappointing. Anyways, we skip ahead to Cinder's faction arriving at Raven's camp and they're not quite tete-a-tete. Raven dresses them down quickly, and here we have another example of the writers toying with an interesting concept briefly, before dismissing it and moving on to the next point.
2 children you've tricked into following you, a disgraced Atlesian scientist, and a fall maiden with a surname so appropriate she probably picked it herself. Something tells me you've got more than a slight case of egomania. Is that about right?
The implication is clear. Raven suspects that Fall is not really Cinder's last name, since it's far too perfect a coincidence for the Fall Maiden to have such a fitting surname. This brings the notion to the viewers that maybe Cinder's last name isn't Fall, which gives way to questions like, if Fall isn't Cinder's last name, what is? Why did she pick a different last name? What was her reason for changing it? Does this tie into her backstory or express something about her character that we don't understand yet? All fairly intriguing questions with interesting potential answers. You'd imagine a viewer would love to know more. But nope, they just never follow up on it. It's said, and then it's forgotten, and fuck you if you thought something would come of it. You should have known better by now. Cinder demands that Raven reveals the Spring Maiden to them, and Raven summons Vernal. Cinder must have had her smart hat on today, because she asks the very pragmatic question of,
Prove it.
when Raven presents Vernal as the Spring Maiden. She then quickly takes her smart hat off, because after Vernal demonstrates her maiden powers, Cinder looks on with an undisguised lust for that power, and buys that display as genuine. Here's the problem. Cinder is the Fall Maiden. If anyone should know how the maiden powers work, it's her. Every time Cinder has manifested the maiden powers, she gets that maiden eye aura flames flare thingy, the maiden eye flare. Every time, even for something so little as manifesting a small ball of fire. Cinder watches intently as Vernal closes her eyes for her demonstration, literally stares at her as she is supposedly using the maiden powers the penultimate episode of the volume revealed actually belonged to Raven, and instead of calling out that Vernal displays no maiden eye flares, she simply believes her. This is an example of the writers working overtime to only half-ass things. They clearly considered the possibility of Cinder clocking Raven as the maiden because of Raven's maiden eye flares when using her powers to summon that storm, the one I'm sure is one of the references alluded to in that episode's title, A Perfect Storm. But didn't consider that, by that very same token, Cinder would be able to deduce that Vernal isn't the Spring Maiden because of the distinct lack of maiden eye flares. Miles and Carrie have Cinder suggest that Vernal proves she's the Spring Maiden, but instead of being absolutely sure and removing any doubt, Cinder just accepts it at face value. I'm sure they'd like to say it's because of her lust for power makes her careless, but honestly that's bullshit. If anything, it should make her more careful. She is so intent on receiving the actual powers, why would she rush through it and jump the gun instead of dotting her I's and crossing her T's and being confident in the veracity of the knowledge that Vernal is the Spring Maiden? The most qualified person in the entire cast to deduce this would be Cinder Fall. There is not a single character better equipped than Cinder to know how the maiden powers work because she's the maiden herself. And yet Raven fools her by wearing a mask. To make matters infinitely worse, Miles and Carrie, right after underestimating our ability to put 2 and 2 together and insulting our intelligence, quite literally have Cinder say,
Raven, I won't underestimate you, so please don't insult my intelligence.
Right after they did that to us. She says that as though she's about to clock the fact that Raven thought she could fool her, but instead of actually doing that, Cinder follows up with a different train of thought entirely, talking about how Raven could never outrun Salem's force. Cinder and Watts reveal Salem's true intention regarding the vaults, and just when Cinder backs Raven into a corner, Raven renegotiates in a way that just so happens to also bring up Ruby, which causes Cinder to lose sight of, pun intended, their goals, and how easy it would be. They had the perfect plan. All they had to do was literally go there when no one was around, quite literally walk in, get the relic, and walk out. But then Raven wanted to get Crow killed, which meant Emerald brought up Ruby, which meant that Cinder fixated on getting revenge, which meant that the simplicity of the plan went to pieces. Still, it was kind of a double-edged sword to alter the plan. Cinder was clever in that she wanted to eliminate two birds with one stone in a way that left no evidence behind, but it also meant that Ruby and her group would be there to foil her plan. The old plan was much simpler, but we couldn't have that, of course. Cinder prioritized her short-term desires over her long-term goals in a way that would have made her volumes 1 to 3 self cringe in embarrassment. Cinder, who used to see potential complications in her plan and adjusted course to account for them, was now needlessly complicating her plan and backing the short play instead of the clever long con. Watts warns her against such a miserable idea, and she disregards him because of revenge. But sure, you know what? It was understandable, even if it was a divergence from Cinder's previous characterization. I understand the yearning for revenge, and Cinder has been wanting to get vengeance on Ruby since Volume 4, so it was at least consistent. But it was simultaneously inconsistent with her Volumes 1 to 3 characterization. You could argue that of course it would be, given that the mating didn't happen until the end of Volume 3, but I still think, even if we account for that, it feels out of character for Cinder to prioritize revenge in a way that jeopardizes their infinitely easy plan, when she could have just executed said plan with ease, and then gotten revenge at a later time and had that guaranteed win instead of making it a gamble. Come the full moon, Cinder arrives to fuck shit up, and I mean that in all ways but literal. She taunts Crow with the knowledge that Raven and Lionheart are allied with them, after Ruby had growled out her literal only word of interaction between her and Cinder during the entire Haven debacle, Cinder's name, and then we cut to the creator's pet and true protagonist of Ruby, Jaune Arc. For some fucking reason, Miles and Carrie thought it would be cute or narratively important to have Jaune confront Cinder about Pierre's death, which, while that isn't inherently a bad thing, ultimately became an awful thing because Cinder doesn't give a fuck about Jaune. She cares, at least textually, about Ruby. We know this because she has on at least 2 separate occasions asked about Ruby.
She wants to know, what about the girl?
Is the girl with him?
And on one other occasion, shown to be thinking about her, quite literally, with Emerald's helpful hallucinations. But despite Cinder's entire motivation, aside from acquiring more power in the form of maiden powers, being to get revenge on Ruby, and despite her having the literal perfect opportunity to do so, specifically because she explicitly fucking planned for this interaction to have Ruby being near her, she ignores Ruby instead to focus on Jaune. Because reasons. We all know the reason. Because Miles Luna loves the sound of his voice and cannot be objective when it comes to writing for the character he voices, and the rest of the writer staff literally enabled this instead of trying to point out that maybe prioritizing Jaune, yet again, for the 15th bajillionth time, might be detrimental to the story. But no, Jaune has the angst and be given screen time, so that means Cinder chooses to focus on him instead of her actual target, because Jaune's wants and needs are more important to the plot than the literal main antagonists. Cinder's desires and motivation take a backseat to Jaune's desire for revenge, so Cinder literally does not even acknowledge Ruby for the rest of the Battle of Haven, despite having organized the Battle of Haven specifically to have her chance at revenge at Ruby, to the point that Cinder literally, quite inexplicably, walks past a prone, unconscious Ruby to focus on hurting Weiss in order to hurt Jaune by proxy. Cinder doesn't give a fuck about Ruby, nor does she even give a fuck about actually hurting Weiss for its own sake. She does it solely to get a rise out of Jaune, so we can get to see Jaune cry again, because Jaune's emotions need to be focused upon, and we need to toy with the idea of literally fridging one of the actual fucking main protagonists of the show, for whom the literal fucking show is named, solely to cause him man pain and allow him to angst about how helpless he is in saving the damsel in distress. Weiss is reduced to a damsel in distress despite her entire arcs being centered around not allowing herself to be defined by a man or her father and actively doing things to acquire and retain her own agency, and all that is thrown out the window because Miles and Carrie would literally rather sacrifice an actual, literal, titular protagonist in the name of Jaune development and him unlocking his semblance. At first, Cinder treated him with the amount of respect and importance he deserved.
Who are you again?
But then, she threw away her motivation for hurting Ruby to focus on toying with him. And then when she did that, when she hurt him through hurting Weiss, she again switched motivations to forget about him and not follow up on killing him, even when she had the chance, because her role was solely to upset Jaune, and therefore when that was complete, she disengaged, didn't bother following up on her Ruby revenge plan, and left to get the relic from the vault. So, to make sure we've got this right, and that we're clear with what happened. A. Cinder compromises the simplicity of her original plan to go to Haven and retrieve the relic when no one is around by complicating it and explicitly planning around the luring of Ruby to Haven in order to get her revenge while she also gets the relic. B. Cinder then arrives at Haven, does not say a single word to Ruby the entire time she's there, and instead decides to focus on Jaune and tormenting him. C. Cinder decides that instead of doing what she came here to do, what she had literally manipulated in order to happen, she is going to throw away that original plan and just fuck with Jaune, someone she has previously never given a fuck about. D. Cinder does so, and in the process of doing so, literally walks past half the reason she had come to Haven in the first place, ignoring a defenseless Ruby who lay unconscious on the ground, so she could prioritize hurting Weiss, just to hurt Jaune by proxy. E. Cinder then decides that once she had hurt Weiss, she has hurt Jaune enough, so she abandons that plan that she had abandoned her original plans for, and then goes back to collecting the relic instead of killing either Jaune or Ruby. F. Fuck! What was the entire fucking point of changing the plan in the first place if she didn't even do what she changed the plan to do? It was an entire waste of time. Time the audience can't get back. It changed nothing. It affected nothing. We sat through that for nothing. Even more insultingly, Cinder mentions,
Right now we've got the upper hand.
so instead of literally doing anything with the upper hand while it was still on their wrist, she doesn't bother killing either of them. Doesn't bother eliminating the one person who has an insta-game over for Cinder every time she so much as blinks her eyes. Doesn't decide to do something that would massively benefit her by killing off the one weakness she has, and instead just fucks off to fetch the relic. Cinder in volumes 1 to 3 was always sticking to the plan, even if she had to alter it a little. The end goal was always the same. She simply accounted for different outcomes or circumstances. She always put the plan over everything, to the point she had explicitly told Emerald and Mercury that as early as Volume 2 and again in Volume 3.
Quiet. Did I not specifically instruct you two to keep your hands clean while in Vale?
I just thought.
Don't think. Obey. Remember the plan. Exactly as discussed. Not a foot out of place.
Cinder in volumes 1 to 3 was clever and methodical. She put in the legwork to get what she wanted, and she was smart about how she made her moves. Cinder in volumes 4 and onward is a fucking idiot with no foresight or planning, who only relies on brute strength and as a result has consistently failed tasks that should have been easy for her. She finally decides to get the show on the road, and goes to fetch the relic with Vernal and Raven. She chats with Vernal, making small talk about how this is the first maiden in no one knows how many years about to unlock a vault, and some part of me wonders if Cinder is envious that she isn't the first to do so, because the beacon vault, or rather the relic can't be found, given that Cinder has in fact visited the vault in Volume 3. It just, presumably, didn't house the relic. And I think it said somewhere that the relic at Beacon is hidden differently than the other three.
Let's just say I made finding the relic at Beacon a bit more challenging than at the other schools.
The beacon relic. My forces have been unable to locate the relic beneath the school. If I know my Ozma, he has used some means of deception to hide its location differently than the others.
Which presumably have vaults, so now would be a good time to subscribe to the Glinda Good, which is the human manifestation of the Crown of Choice theory I first heard about from Phoenix Knight, another Ruby YouTuber. Cinder is kind of fun and teasing here. Still extremely condescending, but you can tell she's into the festivities.
Oh, come now, Raven. Let her enjoy this. It's a once-in-a-lifetime experience.
Kind of sadistic to say this, when she's planning on killing the girl and ending her life in a few seconds, but also that's hilariously Cinder for you. Cinder explains how everything will go down, again playing to her by-the-book nature of planning, and here's where she fucks up. Had Cinder any common sense, she would have waited until after Vernal had opened the vault door, or at least begun the process to open it, before trying to kill her and steal her powers. It would have been another way to make double sure Vernal is actually the Spring Maiden and not just a decoy. But Cinder and stupidity go hand in hand since Volume 5, so what's she gonna do? She at least has the foresight to freeze Raven in place, using Ice Maiden magic that she never uses ever again, so I suppose we should thank heavens for small favors. And then we have the rather cool reveal. Cinder's left arm was destroyed by Ruby, or perhaps so badly damaged that it needed to be amputated, and was replaced by a shadow hand, a type of grim limb. It's pretty cool, but squeaks me out to a certain degree, because the monsterification of beautiful people, or even human characters in general, as the way to symbolize their loss of humanity, never really sits well with me, but certainly a creative and narrative choice that is valid to explore. Cinder discovers that Vernal is not the Spring Maiden, that it is in fact Raven. That was a pretty cool plot twist, even if it raised questions about what the maximum cutoff age you have to be before you are too old to be considered a maiden, even if it's established that once you attain the powers as a young maiden you may retain them well into old age, and draws into question just how old Raven is, but that's not important right now. What's important is how Cinder has the gall to be surprised that Vernal is not the maiden, despite all the evidence pointing towards her not being it. She kills Vernal, or at least seems to, and Raven hits her with the
You won't find it. Because Vernal isn't the Spring Maiden. I am!
Raven explains to Cinder that
Aura can't protect your arm. It's grim.
as though Cinder doesn't know that, or as though the audience is too stupid to know that, because we know that Grimm can generate aura because they lack a soul, so it stands to reason that Cinder's arm wouldn't be protected by her aura. Why Raven doesn't exploit this knowledge, going after Cinder's weak spot she points out herself? We'll never know. Raven also says,
You turned yourself into a monster just for power.
to which Cinder replies,
Look who's talking.
but how did Raven turn herself into a monster? Does Cinder consider becoming a maiden something akin to becoming a monster? Does she believe that she's monstrous for her maiden powers? Thus begins a visually spectacular but very lackluster fight, the first one between any two maidens in the series. Cinder reveals she can absorb maiden magic through her shadow hand, but instead of doing anything while Raven is pinned, she just stands there despite summoning a sword she does nothing with. Also, am I supposed to believe that Raven can just jump that high? We see a little wind, but I don't know if that's maiden magic or just the trail she left behind by displacing air for her jump. Cinder seems to need to rocket her way up using her flames, but Raven didn't. Why? This fight was very much spectacle over substance, because there was no substance. They both summoned gigantic elemental swords, one of flames and one of ice, and they're both shattered after one hit. They trade blows with blades and even swap blades at one point, do no real damage to each other. They chase one another around the vault and no one gets the upper hand. This wasn't a fight, it was a time waster. Raven gets the upper hand on Cinder by not underestimating the usefulness of others, aka she got help from Vernal, who apparently wasn't dead and didn't die in the time it took for their fight despite going still after Cinder's initial attack, so whatever I guess. This would have been a conclusion to Cinder's arc. An unsatisfying one, yes, but still. Cinder being defeated and permanently killed by falling into a void while frozen and no doubt shattering once she hit the bottom. There's no way she could have survived this, right? She was frozen solid, without aura, and falling into a chasm. Though I suppose we should have known better. If we don't see the body, they're not dead. And it's a good thing she wasn't. If she had been truly defeated and killed by Raven, who isn't one of the principal protagonists, Cinder's ending would have been meaningless. Why should Raven be the one to kill off Cinder, or defeat her for good? What thematic reasoning would there be for that? Why would someone who's closer to a villain than a hero be the one to defeat the villain instead of an actual hero? We wouldn't have to find out, thankfully. Cinder was not killed, and for the first time since Volume 4, she was put in an interesting position. She had just failed Salem because of her own greed and placing her ambitions before Salem. As Salem said,
The moment you put your desires before my own, they will be lost to you.
Cinder was now without allies, unable to return home, disgraced, and with nowhere to turn. She had nothing. Her character could go literally anywhere. She's at her lowest and had endless opportunity to grow. How would she recover from this? Where would her character go? What would become of Cinder now that she had time and solitude to discover and define who she was? Sure, we still didn't know her backstory, and it would have been a decent time to reveal or interact with it, but at least now we could see how she would develop as a character and forge her own path. She had nothing, so where would she turn to now? But first, how did she survive? She had her aura shattered, was unconscious, and in an abyss that was revealed to lead to a cavernous lake underground. She should have either been frozen or asphyxiated or drowned, given she, again, had no aura and was unconscious in a body of water. Literally, how could she possibly survive? Plot armor, I suppose. And how could she see the top of the Haven Vault if you can't see the bottom of it from the top? None of this makes any logistical sense in terms of scenery. Side note, this is the only instance I've found of Cinder trying to manifest flames without her maiden magic that didn't generate her maiden eye flare. I don't know if it was an oversight, but given that she had just activated it before and after the scene, I don't know what to make of it. Nevertheless, Cinder was alive and at her lowest. So what would she do? She'd kill someone, because why not? How was she strong enough to kill someone if she was too weak to even stand? This woman couldn't run away? We're just left with the implication of this woman's murder, despite there being no chance in hell Cinder was capable of a fight or subduing someone. But all for the advancement of the plot, whatever. Cinder meets with the Little Miss Malachite and says she's looking for Teams Ruby and Junior. This leads to Little Miss Malachite noticing Cinder's rather jumpy, which she wasn't when she was on the streets of Mistral. But then Little Miss Malachite segues into her allegory of Little Miss Muffet.
A little jumpy today, You know, I used to be afraid of spiders. Want to know what I did about it?
Learn to kill them.
Oh no, the world needs spiders. I just made the spiders work for me.
The scene says a lot about Cinder's Volume 4 and onward mentality. She only solves problems with violence and murder. She no longer thinks strategically or about how to turn something to her advantage like she used to. Before, she would incorporate something that worked against her and make it work for her. Now, she just kills any obstacle, even when unnecessary. The Mistrali woman was 100% willing to help her. She stopped to do so. Then Cinder killed her. I mean, I guess that one was kind of semi-understandable, because the woman was likely to not help her given her fear over her shadow hand, but I honestly doubt Cinder would have even given her the benefit of the doubt. She could have still knocked her out and robbed her, but no, the implication that she was murdered is clear. What's more, Cinder also honestly seems surprised at the concept of subjugating something and making it work for you. This is, allegedly, the same woman who understood that the best way to best her enemies was not to overpower them, but to take away what power they had. These can't be the same characters. Cinder was probably killed and replaced by a Chilgrim, the kind that kill and replace / possess you, at the end of Volume 3, because these cannot be the same characters, not unless some ridiculous amount of character regression was underwent to ruin such a fantastic character they had. Little Miss Malachite requests a week to find Teams Ruby and Junior, and Cinder leaves. Little Miss Malachite is smart in that she's trying to double her business every opportunity she can, and that pays off in the form of Neo wanting info on Cinder. Cinder collects her information shortly after, deducing that her foes are headed towards Atlas, but before she can do anything about it, Little Miss Malachite lets on she knows Cinder's true identity and appreciates Cinder for bringing her twice the business. That setup in Chapter 2 was followed up by the return of a fan favorite Neapolitan, and she's back for blood. This was a fun fight. Plus, it debuted a song that did all the heavy lifting of Neo's backstory that the show itself couldn't be bothered to do. What I like about this fight in particular is that it's between two antagonists, both of whom had previously been on benevolent terms. When this episode came out and I saw the fight, I immediately flashed back to the scene in Volume 3 of Cinder praising Neo as a getaway driver.
Well, you all performed marvelously. Driver included.
Back when Cinder wasn't above being benevolent to her lackeys, and even included Neo in that positive reinforcement. It's not often I see villains who work together have disagreements that result in their antagonizing each other. I just like the dynamicism of that. The antagonists don't just fight the good guys, they also have disagreements and physical altercations between each other. The dysfunction is beautiful, and something we usually see within the protagonists when they fight amongst friends. To see the villains have these problems too also humanizes them, and it's just something I really enjoy watching. Neo doesn't take the fight seriously until Cinder pulls a page out of One Piece's Flame Fist Ace's book, and has, well, a fistful of flames. And Cinder doesn't take the fight seriously until she summons a vortex pillar of wind to push off Neo, who had been doing rather well. Cinder did have a little bit of development here though. She seems to have taken Raven's advice about watching her back to heart, but as Volume 8 shows us, Cinder doesn't seem to retain lessons very well, at least not beyond their immediate use to her. She convinces Neo to offload her rage onto Ruby instead of her, and they strike up an allyship for the nonce. and that means my feelings on this are complicated. On the one hand, it makes sense for Cinder to try and gain allies right now, given she's at her weakest and she can't really go it alone. Her successes and victories were a result of her understanding and comprehending the power of villainous friendship, or at least some facsimile of it, without the genuine friendship part, since it's more of a mentor to her minions kind of dynamic. On the other hand, it is just another resetting of the status quo. Instead of Cinder having to figure things out and being clever or resourceful, she is just going to have Neo do everything for her. She doesn't have to rely on her own skill set or making things happen. She subscribes to the Salem School of Study, where she does literally nothing. Now that Neo is back to hench girl status, Cinder informs her as to the truth of the relics, and presumably the maidens. I can't imagine that Neo didn't have questions after seeing Cinder summon a vortex of wind out of nowhere, and says this.
Now you understand. I've got to get the relic before it can be secured in Atlas. It's the only way that Salem... It's the only way we can accomplish our goal. You're not the only one who wants Ruby dead. But unfortunately, Salem does not feel the same way. I've been instructed not to kill her. But you have no such orders. You can do as you please. Help me get to Atlas. Help me find her. And the rest is up to you.
Cinder says it like Neo won't be doing everything.
Help me get to Atlas.
So Neo's going to get Cinder to Atlas.
Help me find her.
So Neo's going to find Ruby.
And the rest is up to you.
What rest? Neo is going to do everything. What is Cinder doing in this entire plan? Nothing. The writers demoted the main antagonist from actually antagonizing anyone to having her subcontract the job to Neo. And yes, it makes sense in a sense, because Cinder is trying to weaponize Neo in order to circumnavigate Salem's edict, because Cinder is circumspect, but only to a degree. She's willing to take a risk in killing Ruby, but not by doing the deed herself. She's trying to be crafty and cunning, like her old volumes 1 to 3 incarnation, but it's a hard sell because of how bafflingly stupid she's been since volume 4 or 5. Still, she's trying to return to form. That's the good thing, isn't it? Only in so much that she's being smart about her defying Salem. But it is still bad in terms of her doing literally nothing, not getting to Atlas by herself, not acquiring the relic herself, not tracking down Ruby, nothing. But Neo makes a deal with the devil and shakes hands with Cinder. An unholy alliance has been made. Off-screen, at the end of Volume 6, we see Cinder and Neo both sporting new outfits. It is never explained, but Oscar got the same treatment, so whatever. I guess Cinder, Neo, and Oscar got their new outfits early as everyone else changed in Volumes 7 and 8. However, I do find it exceptionally odd that Cinder has been largely associated design-wise with the colors of red and yellow or gold, but now her primary color for her latest outfit is black with a gold trim. That's incongruent with her design language, and I also feel like covering up her back tattoo of her emblem just like her last Mistral outfit did is a poor choice. The color thing especially, it feels like they're trying to give Cinder a clean break from her previous design and characterization, but did she have to abandon her signature color to do so? Neo has stolen a perhaps older model, or is that just the current model and not as advanced as the Atlesian aircrafts? Mistrelli airship, with Cinder being dismissive in that saying it should get them to the continent of Solitas, I love that word, and implying that they'd have to hoof it the rest of the way.
It should get us to Solitas. After that, you might want to try materializing yourself some snow boots.
Cinder's meaning is clear. There's no way the ship is going to be allowed to enter Atlas airspace, but Neo has a solution in the form of overactive imagination, and cloaking the ship to appear like an Atlas one. What strikes me about this scene is how Cinder is just dismissive and condescending. Previously, as evidenced in Volume 3, Cinder would have praised Neo, given her some positive reinforcement, and made sure to recognize her effort like she did when she drove the emergency medical aircraft. Now here, doubled the series later, from Volume 3 to Volume 6, Cinder doesn't even try to engage with any pleasantries and has dropped the facade entirely. I do not know why. It isn't like her previous complimenting of them ever backfired or wasn't proven to be effective in keeping them loyal. She just does not react the same way in the same scenario or situation like she used to. Why? It would have cost her nothing to compliment Neo, to dot her I's and cross her T's and make sure that their newly found nebulous alliance would be strengthened by any means necessary. Cinder is suitably impressed when Neo cloaks the ship to make it look Atlesian, and again, she doesn't bother acknowledging her being impressed or handing Neo a compliment. She just says,
You know, Neo, someone once asked me if I believed in destiny. And I'm happy to say, I still do.
She's obviously referencing Pyrrha, but this is interesting in that it brings up questions that I hadn't considered before back in Volume 3 when she last mentioned believing in destiny, largely because we didn't know core concepts of Cinder's character then, and to a large degree, still don't. If Cinder believes in destiny, does she believe that she was fated to be a maiden? Then why did she have to go out of her way to steal the maiden powers instead of letting them come naturally to her? Does she believe that she was destined to be maimed by Ruby Rose's silver-eyed warrior powers? Does she believe that she was destined to get her shit stomped in by Raven Bronwyn? Does she believe that she was destined to be, as Volume 8 would reveal, tortured as a child and kept as a child slave? Does she believe she's destined to fail time and again because of her own stupid actions and consequences that she apparently can never learn from? Does she believe all that happened for a reason? Why would a character who has underwent so much trauma and bad experiences believe in a preordained fate for them? Why would she believe that those traumatic events to her had to happen? If anything, Cinder should be the type of person who believes in defying fate, bucking destiny and the constraints placed upon her, and rising up from one's shitty Cinderella on steroids like circumstances and taking destiny into her own hands, the way she mentioned Pyrrha did in Volume 2. Cinder's character should be a giant fuck you to fate. Even if she's a villain, she should be a conduit to convey the concept of refusing to have your destiny determined for you, and instead choosing her own path in life and carving out her own fate. Ideally, that should have been Pyrrha, but that is a whole other topic for another day if I ever get around to analyzing Pyrrha Nikos' character and arc. If you believe in the concept of destiny, you have to believe in all of it. You don't get to pick and choose what parts of your life are destiny and what aren't. Either everything is ordained or you're defying the fates. I don't think there's a middle ground, at least one that makes for a satisfying narrative within the context of the show.